when I said that of the two shows I was really looking forward to in the summer anime season this year, I didn't expect Cells at Work to be the one people were talking about all the time? Well, this is the other one. By virtue of it having a darker theme and not being educational in nature, I thought that it was going to be more popular than Cells at Work, but it turned out to be the opposite. Maybe I should have expected as much, but between the two, I'm glad this one was pretty much overlooked by comparison. That's not to say that I have any less investment in this other series myself. Until JoJo came back, this one was my Friday hype train. The announcement that Angels of Death was getting its last 4 episodes released as an ONA also kind of shook me for a little bit. I was asking myself all the questions, like why does that need to be a thing? Will Crunchyroll still have it subbed? Is Funimation going to be able to finish the simuldub? Is it not suitable for TV, or is it just to fit a network schedule that was only allowed to air 12 episodes? I was in a bit of a tizzy, to be completely honest. Angels of Death is an interesting show, to say the least, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't have a more personal interest as a fan of the source material than a lot of people who went in blind. So what that means is I can't be unbiased the way a review is ideally supposed to be. But I will try my darndest to say what I think is important about it and will be willing to criticize its faults. With that said, welcome people of Earth and Elsewhere to the Spam channel where Crackers will now be attempting to review Satsurigo no Tenchi, or Angels of Death. Shall we? The beginning is the best place to start, and Angels of Death starts with a strong first impression by most accounts. Based off of the RPG Maker game of the same name, the story follows this young girl, Rachel Gardner, as she wakes up with amnesia in the enormous basement of a mysterious building. She hears an announcement stating that she is now a sacrifice in some sort of game and has to find a way out. The events of the first episode conclude with a very sudden change in Rachel, which for an unstated reason leads her to ask the scythe-wielding serial killer to, well, kill her. Surprisingly creeped out by the request, the killer we come to know as Zack eventually strikes a bargain with Rachel, and they promise to help each other. With Ray as the brains and Zack as the brawn, the duo ventures forward to escape the hellscape they've been landed in, and then, and only then, will he grant Rachel the sweet sensation of no longer living. Following this premise, the show keeps its watchers around primarily by retaining the mystery surrounding most of the questions this first episode presents, and the wonder of when and how they are going to be answered. Does the show accomplish this in an effective way? From a production standpoint, the answer would be yes. The animation is consistently solid, using quite a bit of computer-generated models for backgrounds and props that don't clash outlandishly with the 2D characters. Though, this could be my own personal experience, as I've slowly but surely been getting used to CG in my 2D anime. It's not bad, it's just there, and I don't really find it that distracting, but there are other people who might. The music, while less impressive, is appropriate for any given scene, though here a strong criticism could be made that many key scenes, as shown in the anime, would benefit from the use of tracks found in the original game, which is something other such adaptations have done in the past, and makes me wonder why it wasn't done here outside of one hidden instance. What the audience is given does not necessarily break the experience, but the same scenes as presented in the game of pixel sprites somehow come across more effectively in terms of emotion and tone, based solely in the strength of its music. It is truly a shame to have this complaint. In the end, it looks good, it sounds okay, and the voice acting is spot on, being amazing in the Japanese, and having a great English dub that features as many callbacks to the dialogue of the original game as possible. Thank you, Caitlin Barr. Now, does the show accomplish its mysterious quest to answer questions in an effective way in terms of story and plot? This is far more subjective, but as one who loves the series to pieces, I can honestly say, not really. The questions we are given at the start all involve Rachel, her past, the memories she's lost, how she's ended up in this place, and why she wants to die. These are all things that don't get answered in any haste. They do, but they may as well be the last thing the series thought about, and the fact that Rachel becomes a borderline inactive mannequin immediately preceding the plot-driving promise doesn't do that any favors. Rachel is pretty boring, and the desire to have questions answered about her is the only solid aspect that keeps the viewer invested in her character at all. Because she has death on her mind, and only that for most of the story, everything she says is practically played on loop, and that's not even amusing, unless you count Zack graciously pointing out how one-note and boring she is. Instead, the series goes about most of its way presenting more questions as they come, answering those almost immediately, and giving more development and story elements to Zack. To its credit, he ends up being the strongest character in the show, both metaphorically and physically, and that's saying something considering he leaves a very basic first impression. He's a killer covered in bandages, like some sort of rip-off of a particularly bad creepypasta. As far as the audience feels, that's all they need to know about him in the first episode. That's all there is to it, and they can live with that because Rachel is supposed to be the important one, right? Well, that's what we thought. Next to Rachel, Zach is expressive, dynamic, and a riot to have around, bringing out every one of the most emotional moments from comical to the tragic ones. So, while the viewer expectations may have been turned on their heads a bit, reversing the levels of investment in the two leads, it is hard for the world's dumbest serial killer to carry the show when it's little Lady Ray, who we actually want to know more about because of her introduction, and we don't get that until so much later. This aspect is understandably frustrating and can be a major turnoff. The good news is, at the halfway point, the show manages to re-grab viewers' attention and investment in Ray by presenting a surprise factor that really just leaves them with more questions. As far as other characters go, there aren't a lot of them, and when we're not asking questions about the supporting cast, they are doing their best to try and murder our leading man and lady. Or are they? At this point, it seems appropriate to discuss what kind of show this is supposed to be. Horror. The show isn't scary. I find that there are few anime that manage to correctly set a mood and build the kind of tension it needs to effectively scare an audience, and this is coming from someone who has an active imagination and is scared rather easily. While some scenes can be off-putting or disturbing based off of individual perception, there isn't a lot going for it in terms of pure horror. A little spooky at best, and at worst it suffers a lot, especially in the first half, from not being able to hold a tone if it manages to get to that tone. Mystery, much more of that as mentioned above, along with the series of snippets and hints along the way. There is an end to these means, and the questions first brought up at the start are answered. Psychological. Without delving too far into spoilers, it can honestly be said that in the case of at least the two leading characters, psychology and mental state are a significant part of the story. This particular genre seems to be the strongest suit for the show. Thriller. It can't really set a tone, but if you count the cliffhangers that are surprisingly effective as thrilling, then I suppose you could call it that too. And adventure. It's really more of a quest than an adventure, but hey, what can you do? These are the most commonly used genres that it is described as. Now, as an adaptation. As far as adaptation goes, the anime known as Angels of Death is almost beat for beat what it is in the original game. This means two things. One, that if you were looking for a true-to-form adaptation of a game to an anime, it doesn't get much better than this, with minor changes made to suit the medium better and some things added for story purposes. And two, that many of the complaints about the story, plot, and characters from the anime are pretty reflective of the game. While character expression, more dynamic animation, and voice acting, like in the anime, greatly benefit characters like Zack, doll-like characters like Rachel get very little change. Also, the pacing can seem a little strange at times, and the suspension of disbelief for things like how long has he been bleeding now is much harder to retain when the audience is not actively controlling the speed at which the story progresses. On another note, details. One thing that JC's staff decided to do was effectively dodge every instance in the anime where Rachel's age is mentioned in the game, and that leaves a rather sour taste in my mouth, seeing as there are a few very clear reasons why that choice would be made. 13. She's 13 years old, guys. Also, there are incidents in the third quarter that don't effectively explain how Rachel is able to overcome a certain impending obstacle where the game has a legitimate explanation, but that is a story for another time. Angels of Death is a solid adaptation of its source material. It even made sure to end the exact same way. That's not a good thing. The nature of the ending of the show is of hot debate among the people who managed to watch it all the way through, and I'm going to go ahead and say you have 3 seconds to mute the potential spoilers and wait for the visual cue to know when to turn the sound of the video back on. The ending is left open and possibly open to interpretation. This is where the lack of consistency and constant asking of questions leaves a big hole in what should be understood, just as the literal events that play out in front of the viewer. Is it poor planning, plot holes, or just a lack of computer sprites that makes it so hard to determine how the show really ends? At the tail end of it, I was really hoping that the anime would remedy some of the problems that the ending presented in the game, but we got an almost one-to-one translation of the source material for it. If there was anything they were going to change, it should have been so that there would be no debate one way or another. In light of this, I can say that by the time I personally got to the final scene and credits, it was worth all of the temporary frustration and repetitious dialogue following all the unanswered questions from before. Speaking of which, before I summarize my review and end this video, I wanted to address a couple of things I've seen other people say about the show. It's edgy. In terms of initial reaction, this seems to be a common one, and I can't say it's really that. Edgy seems to be the kind of word that's lost its meaning recently, and I don't know what kind of anime you've been watching to call this edge. Is it because of the blood fountain in episode 1? Because that is about as visceral and edgy as the show gets. Now, my standards for edge are things like Elfenlied, Hellsing Ultimate, and Deadman Wonderland. And as a person who only actually liked one of those shows, I can honestly say that Angels of Death could have afforded to involve more gore. What we got in the show was barely more horrifying than the pixelated blood in the game. Cells at Work was arguably more violent. And then we have the important question, should you watch the anime or play the game? Who you ask this question to will give you different answers, but apparently there are a good number of people who automatically made the connection that the anime felt like a playthrough of a video game without knowing what the source was. I can't speak for everyone, so I'll just say what I said about it at the end of my first run-through of the game. The story is more suited to animation. In the game, the music is better, the suspension of disbelief is stronger, and it is arguably scarier. But those things aside, I once said that the game was weak in a sense of actual play. A majority of the time spent in it is just reading dialogue. The puzzles aren't that challenging, and there's only one choice in the entire game that affects the ending, and it's not even a decent payoff. In the anime, we get more expressive characters, better animation makes it easier to see what's actually going on in a given scene, and extra additions to the story are in there. While either anime or game gives you essentially the same story, I retain the opinion that the anime is better for telling it because the playing of the game wasn't what was interesting or fun. It was the story it had to tell, so I felt that as something you had to play, it was short of its goal. In conclusion, Angels of Death gets a passing grade in my book, but that is probably in part due to the book having a rather large learning curve. It's a solid adaptation of the game it's based off of, for better or for worse. While the animation and voice acting lend themselves more to the feeling of the show, the music doesn't hold a candle to that of the source, a thing that's not much of a problem if you weren't acquainted with the original or don't want to be. The show, while being called horror, hardly is true to that fact. But it does mystery much better, and the psychological aspect of it is definitely its strongest suit. The characters range from entertaining to annoying, who is up to the viewer obviously, and in an ironic twist, Zack becomes the favored lead character where Rachel more or less waits for half of the series to become somebody who you would actually think is worth investing time in. At a total of 16 episodes, the wait for the payoff is not terrible, and now that the run is complete, it is much easier to get to that payoff. The ending is within the realm of skepticism, and discussing it will be saved for a whole other video, but, much like the rest of both the game and the anime, it can be concluded that the events that transpire should be taken at face value and seen for what it is we are shown. While it's no surprise that the series fell behind other more notable anime this season, I recommend Angels of Death to those who want an intriguing story that makes its best marks with characters and the eventual finale of the tale it has to tell. And that would be all for this review. Thank you to everyone who watched this review up until this point. I hope you found it informative and got something out of it regarding the series. If you have already watched the anime or played the game and have opinions you'd like to express as well, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Like this video if it gave you something to think about, and be sure to subscribe for future content. Or follow me on Twitter to get a general idea of the nerdism I've been up to. I am far from finished with talking about Angels of Death, so if you'd like to see more about it, look forward to that. You can find this and other Angels of Death fan art on my DeviantArt, linked in the description below, along with other things I've tried to draw in the past. Suggestions for future videos, anime to watch, art to make, etc. are all welcome, and you can leave those in the comments as well. Once again, thanks to all the people who managed to watch this video all the way through, and I hope to see you in the next one. Ciao!
私が分かったら